Namaste and greetings. I, Diya Goswami, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav, एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्था नई दिल्ली, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today we have gathered here for a book discussion on the book Home, Belonging and Memory in Migration, Leaving and Living, edited by Dr. Sadan Jha and Professor Pushpendra, published by Routledge. This deliberation is organized by IMPRI Center for Work and Welfare. Now let me take this moment to introduce the gathering. As the chair for our event, we have with us Professor Prabhu Mohapatra, professor at the Department of History, University of Delhi. We are honored to have you, sir. The editors of the book, Dr. Sadan Jha, who is an associate professor at the Center for Social Studies, Surat, and Professor Pushpendra, the chairperson at the Center for Development Practice and Research, TIS Patna, and a professor at TIS Mumbai. We are glad to have you here. Our panelists consist of Professor Anjali Gera, professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, Dr. Deepra Dandekar, Research Fellow, India, Indian Ocean, Contested Religion, Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient, Berlin, and Professor Dilip Menon, Director at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa and Mellon Chair in Indian Studies, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. We welcome you all. As our discussants, we have with us today Dr. Asha Singh, who is an associate professor in Gender Studies, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata, and Dr. Swati Mantri, social researcher, sociologist, and social anthropologist. We welcome you to the session. Now, I would like to invite the chair for our session, Professor Mohapatra, to commence the discussion with their opening remarks and to proceed with the session. We look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you. And first, I must say it's a great honor, but more than the great honor, it's a great pleasure on being here to be in the same panel with my friends whom I haven't met and have interacted for a long period of time. Partly the COVID is, but partly also because many of us, like the subject of this book, many of my friends are migrants, and we haven't had, though they circulate, they come home. I find it really a great occasion to be in the same panel with Dilip, with Sadan, who was a student of our department, and we had a great pleasure, and with Pushpendra. I can't tell you how good it is to have read your book and to be asked to comment in the beginning. I know my colleagues here, my friends here, and also my esteemed co-panelists here, they have a lot to say about the book. I would first, let me preempt most of it by saying this is a fascinating book. This is an excellent book. This is a book which should have been written, and the fact that it comes out at a time when migration, with all its ambiguity, suddenly emerges in front of us, has seared into our consciousness with its images of vulnerability, of resistance, of silence, of the many stories that it can tell, stories of migration. The fact that it has come out at this time, it is an apt, I think it's very apt that we are discussing this book. And first, I want to comment on the quality of the articles in general. I want to say, I would have loved to find ways of at least in a way critically appreciating it. I can only say that each of these articles, each of them surprised me by the excellence of the material they presented, by the quality of the investigation, by the passion with which it is written, by the truth. I am really, really humbled by the fact of so much insights coming from it. It was great to have read the book and to, so I compliment the authors and the editors for writing a brilliant introduction and for having woven together thematically this book. If I'm being so generous with my compliments, please don't take it otherwise. It is a genuinely heartfelt thing coming from a fellow researcher. I've been a migration researcher for long. So I find this very important that we are sitting here to discuss this book and the themes of this book at a particular moment, which is, I find, very important. So with this in mind, I just begin. First and foremost, let me set what I expect my co-panelists to do. I think they would take up whatever the thematic, they're eminent in their own ways, but also deeply immersed in their research, so they can respond to it. I cannot set standards, or I cannot set the what are the parameters. I can only comment on some of the issues that came up in my mind while reading the book differently. I can't, or no one can, discuss each of the articles with which it richly deserves to be discussed. So I would be I would be necessarily selective in my reflection, as will be perhaps my colleagues, but I want to leave it. Let me first begin by reflecting on how the notion of belonging, which is said to be central to the discussions in the book, or the thread which binds together, weaves together all the articles, is the notion of belonging. The belonging is necessarily connected to some idea, some place, and so then the notion of the home. But what's amazingly interesting is in each of these articles, each of the essays which are presented, the home is not at all, home is not necessarily only one place, or as the editors and their introduction say, the home also can be someplace else. The switching of the home with someplace else, that means between the destination as well as the home and the destination switching themselves, I think that is the center point of, so where do you belong? And that's where I think that it's not just merely an academic question or even a philosophical reflection. It is in fact what you call an empirical truth, that actually home lies, or to fix the home is in some ways to curtail this process that we now know as what we know as the theme of this book, but also the theme of, or also the most prominent way in which migration presents to us, presents in front of us, or migration as a subject for us. So this switching of the home and the destination, that I think is brilliant. It's central in some ways. What appears as home at one point can become the destination, as it was so clearly shown in the pandemic reverse migration. The second point, which follows from this, is that in some ways the studies of migration on the one wing of the migration studies have always felt migration as a sense of loss, as something which is separating from the place of belonging. So migration is a process of unbelonging. Yet on the other hand, we have seen the opposite, which happens continuously. That means the desire to belong to someplace else also simultaneously. So, given this, what the editors have pointed out, and what I think is absolutely true, given this, the blurring, or not necessarily blurring, the transcending of the boundaries, the binaries which have defined migration studies, is in itself a great achievement. Not only a great achievement, it is something which has to be done continuously. You cannot rest there. By transcending, you continuously, at the same time as you transcend it, you reproduce this double condition of the home and elsewhere simultaneously. So that's a number one. That's an important and interesting point, I think, which has been repeatedly said. The second, and I think that's also which struck me in the book, is the marrying together of what is it said, intertwining of social realities or objective structures with subjective experience. Now that is supposedly that should have been done all the time. That should have been always been there in migration studies. But as the editors have said, and that's quite true, the migrant emerges as a figure in its modernity as stripped of all attributes which are either, in some sense, very interestingly pointed out in the editorial and the introduction, as meek commodities. Commodities which are meek, which is a strange neologism, but I like this term, the meek commodities, as someone at the same time as being stripped of all social attributes to become something called a migrant, which can be counted by its purely objective, through an objective grid, can be counted, but at the same time, it must also simultaneously be meek. It cannot be, so meekness is, so without attribute, yet passively structured. That's what meekness, a meek commodity. So here, marrying together or bringing together, intertwining the objective structure with, or in some sense, privileging the subjective, but not abandoning the social realities, but in some sense, intertwining them. There are 2 points at which the editorial, I think, or the introduction or the book also kind of lurches from whether one should privilege the subjective or one should also bring in the objective in some in equal measure. And I think that's an intellectual concern, best seen in. I think I found Pushpendra's article on the village making, migration making of village, absolutely fascinating. I don't want to say it all, but I found it so interesting, not only by the idea of the making of the villages and the thing, and at the same time, the migrants not only making cities, but making the villages, but at its origin or at making the village actually, but also transforming it continuously through the migrant acts. Now, that was fascinating. But there itself, in the article, I think classically, the way classic ethnography of allowing the voice of the migrant or the voice of the subject to emerge and to be integrated into the, I think I really found it so satisfying reading it after ages, reading some ethnographic or ethnographic account of this of the village, migrant-made village, as you said. I found it absolutely fascinating. I think I take it as emblematic of the methodological, at least the methodological, what do you call the standpoints taken by the authors, and many of all of the articles. I would not say that. I don't want to point. I just wanted to point out Pushpendra's article for the way it brought together. The other is, of course, Sadan's own article, which I found fascinating, the way he brought together his personal experience as a migrant with certain experiences of all other migrants who made Surat city. I found it really, really also because having especially because of Jan Bremen's early writing on Surat and after the 1992 riot. I think that we all had a personal kind of stake in kind of understanding what happened in Surat, given that the migrants were blamed at one time, but also the victims were victimized in some sense. So in Jan's article about the Surat informal workers, the connections he had made first time, I think, between informality and communal riots, which he later explicated later in Ahmedabad, how in Ahmedabad this continuously the expulsion of workers from the formal sector provides the basis on which communal riots took place regularly there. So with all that in mind, I've had several, I would say, Samita Sen's very interesting article on gender, which I found important, and where she, then our colleague and student, Dilip would also agree. Dheeraj in a way, passionate writing about making how migrant, say the identity of migrant, in some ways goes toward dissolving caste barriers or earlier barriers, and tries to produce at least a visionary hope of a dignified life. Now, it would appear cliched in anyone else's hand, but in Dheeraj's writing, it acquires a certain, certain strength and a certain, and I would like to believe with him about that in the conditions that they were there in, how migrants could produce a vision of a better life, and did actually produce in some sense, knowing how terrible the condition is in the coal fields. But even in that, they produce this idea of, in some ways, the notion of agency, which I think the editors have tried hard to bring into the migrant agency. We need to see it in these forms. It doesn't come out only in an individualized agency form. Migrants do not constitute a kind of, as we saw in terms of voting behavior or any of these, they do not constitute a block, a collective, which can be easily. But here we see it is possible to derive a certain collectivity, not in form of these ideas of. There are excellent other articles I would like to say, but the 3 points which have been the blurring of transcending the home and elsewhere, subject and subjective experience and objective reality, or in some ways bringing them together in some interesting manner. I think the editors have succeeded brilliantly, but more than that, each of the authors have done. I particularly liked also, I don't know if I want to go a little bit more, 2 minutes, the notion of simultaneity, which was there in Amitabh Hede's article on Konkan. I actually, it looked as if someone had snatched these terms when one was all the time struggling to find words to explain these questions of migrant. Where do you place the migrant? The notion of simultaneity actually is a really, really interesting concept. That it is both in empirical terms, simultaneous. They exist in two places at the same time, it appears in some ways, but also generationally, there is simultaneity. So a spatial dislocation is transformed, or at least the spatial distance is temporarily closed. The gap between spaces are temporarily closed through this idea of simultaneity. I think that's an interesting and important idea. If I have something to end with, I would like to, and not say, I would say that the promise of the introduction, in which I think Pushpendra and Sadan promised that they felt that migration studies have generally been migration has been seen as a temporal phenomenon rather than as a spatial, or reflections on migration in a spatial sense have been much less, or in fact absent, compared to it as a temporal phenomenon. I was a bit intrigued by that because I've kept on waiting for the spatial question to be taken up in the introduction, which I think either it got diffused or it didn't come out very strongly. That's an important point because it's there in many of the essays, but I would have liked some reflection on that. Finally, what I say about the introduction, about the book, and especially a point which is there in the introduction, which I wanted to kind of really reinforce and really kind of support, reiterate, because it was somehow this nearly 30 million Indian workers who walked back during that time were supposed to have walked back because they were like some homing pigeons. The words which were used were so amazing. You see, migration has always been kind of had a biological kind of basis. The first studies of migration were butterflies. So it's always had this biological thing in it. People, the word they used was homing pigeons. They, whenever they're in trouble, they go home. And I saw, I think in the introduction, a solid, I think, answer to that. Of course, it can be done many ways. This is such a misnomer, such an amazing misnomer about understanding migration. The precise reason migration or so-called homing instinct of the migrants are forefronted is precisely to suppress the political nature of migration. Now, that's the most important reason why the politics, inherent politics of migration as an inherently political act, is to be normalized by stripping it of its attributes and social attributes on the one hand, but also by giving it a biological dimension. So it is put into the world of nature rather than of culture or of agency and action. You are just moving just like some homing instinct ideas, and this comes from some of the best writers. I'm here mentioning someone whom I really like, whose work I really like, Chinmay Tumbe, who also cannot but explain this only in terms of this, the reverse migration, only in terms of this homing instinct. Somehow, by comparing it in 1918 migration or reverse migration during 19. So I've always noticed that the best of the writers have this in their mind. And I feel the reason, and that may be a final thing to reflect on, why or where should we look for migrations, the political implication of migration? Should we see it in the actual political behavior that, or in forms of resistance? Where do we find that? How do we find it? And the essays in the book tell us of many sites at which the political implications of migration or migration as an inherently political act can be found. All I want is that we should reflect on it and draw out more explicitly its political significance. I end by complimenting the editors and the authors once more. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Over to you, Sadan sir and Pushpendra sir.
Thank you, Prabhu. That was really, quite uplifting coming from you. Without any further ado, I would, I think that if Professor Pushpendra can speak a little bit about the process, some key aspects.
Yes, I would like to basically present the key arguments of the book, but let me say in the beginning that the 13 papers which you see in the book are they are a mix of invited and selected papers. We gave an open call for papers, and some of the papers which came, including Swati Mantri's paper, was through this open process of, say, inviting papers. And all of these papers, they underwent a rigorous review process, something like you have in any reviewed journals. And so I would like to give full credit to the authors also, not only to the editors, who readily agreed to our repeated and often in installments, our suggestions or our demands for revision in their paper, and they really did that. And I see Asa smiling here, and she was perhaps troubled also by us. So Let me present some, say, core arguments of the book, and I tried to write it down so that I'm within the time limit which was given to me, 5 minutes. So let me read it out. And the book connects the thread of home, belonging, and memory by delving deep into migrant subjectivities. The book urges us to depart from the dominant understanding of migration as an aberration to a so-called normal sedentary life impelled by economic factors. It focuses on the centrality of migration in the making of society and views migrants as active agents with their own determination of selfhood and location. The papers in the volume explore the journey, the shift, the movement, or the processes between leaving, that is the home, and leaving away from home. And as you have rightly pointed out, Professor Prabhu, that by home we are not excluding any one of them, and basically we are also at the same time not romanticizing the idea of that longing for home, and particularly in the context of COVID. So this process, its temporal entanglements and socio-spatial embedding lead to the emergence of multiple coordinates between living and leaving. The book argues that the ideas and imageries of home and belonging never leave a migrant, even though she or he leaves his or her dwelling. The book challenges the understanding of migration, often framed in the binaries of living and living, as well as staying and mobility, where home is envisioned as a privileged epistemic location. Instead, the volume argues, based on a broad overview of human history, for treating the human movement as an ordinary rather than exceptional dimension of human life. We are aware of the risk of normalizing migration, as it may undermine and trivialize the exploitative, traumatic, and agonizing aspects of the sufferings caused by migration and associated displacement and dislocation. Normalizing mobility might also potentially entail normalizing the forces responsible for such suffering and letting them off the hook. At the same time, we argue that migrants cannot be treated as mere objects that are devoid of sociality and subjectivities. One of the core arguments of the book is to consider, borrowing from Drogmassi and Mersman, demigrantization of migration research and migrantization of research on society and culture, initiating a process of normalization. Migrant subjectivity emanates from the conceptualization of migrants' agency. What is pertinent from the point of view of research is the question how to access migrants' agency and what specificity can be attached to migrant subjectivity. It is a question of both epistemic investment as well as investigating deep into social structures. That is, migrants' agency and subjectivity should not be treated in isolation from the processes, institutions, practices, and forces that go into the making of a migrant. The making of migrant subjectivity in itself is complex. It leads to the questions such as how the migrant conceives her or his own self, how migrants articulate and conceptualize their own migrant status through their understanding of the linkages with the social realm. Our argument is that a migrant subjectivity may or may not get directly framed in terms of agency or, for that matter, identity. In that sense, we argue that compared to identity or agency and their politics, the field created by an interaction between home, memory, and belonging is far more ambiguous and amorphous. Another core argument of the book is that the figure of the migrant is a modern conception. And one of the expressions of this modern figure is the lack of appropriate words for migrants and migration in India's vernacular traditions. This highlights the disjuncture between the social reality of migration and its conceptualization in vernacular languages. But I will leave this discussion here. Let me briefly discuss the core ideas of the book on belonging. Scholars have hardly paid attention to the question of belonging in the context of labor migration. One reason for this is the dominance of the causal or cause-effect framework in migration studies. In reality, the question of belonging is a messy, incoherent, fractured, partial, and fragmented experience. In the usual sense, belonging is about connection, attachment, linkages, and relatedness. However, the strength of the concept of belonging lies in its openness and fluidity, leaving enough room to engage with politics of access and spatial complexities in the making of social, emotional, and the affective. The book further tries to address the complicated relationship between belonging and identity. We argue that these two concepts do not form exclusionary zones of understanding social reality. Identity constitutes a stark social reality that cannot be whisked away. In fact, the two quite often intersect with each other. Belonging or non-belonging overlaps with the politics of othering of migrants. The book argues for a framework of analysis that parallelizes belongingness and identity in migration. I would like to end by reiterating that subjectivities, belongingness, and the affective dimension of the migrant social realities are better understood through narratives and analysis than through measurements. Migration studies required a methodological shift, which can provide a vantage point from which one can reflect upon some key threads of the migration discourse. So I will stop here. And there is another dimension, home, which Professor Prabhu Mohapatra has discussed, which is one of the key arguments of the book. And I would like to Sadan to dwell on that. I think I have taken around seven and a half minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pushpenji. I won't take much time, just few, perhaps, in continuation with the threads opened by Professor Prabhu Mohapatra and Professor Pushpendra. In that spirit of conversation, I'm very happy to take the question, the issue raised by Prabhu about the spatial aspects, or the promises that we make in the introduction, but somehow we have not kept that. I have two responses. One is I happily accept that. However, if you look at the ways in which each of the chapters dwell on issues like simultaneity that you talked about in case of Western Maharashtra by Amita Bide and Kalyani Bartak, or the memories, cultural memories that come through the papers by Asa, who is here, or in different, for example, Pushpen's piece. In each of these, there is a kind of subjectivities about these spaces that come, that we thought are coming quite naturally. Perhaps I take this point that we could have analyzed that further, emphasized it further. But in a way, these narratives, these renderings, or these accounts we found so powerful in itself. Or the spatial politics, for example, of Surat in my case, or in Swati's case about Marwari communities' experiences of Calcutta. So in certain ways, all these accounts are spatially located accounts, where it's not merely the subjectivities of migrant communities, but some kind of spatial subjectivities are foregrounded. So perhaps, but I take that point, we could have sometimes in editorial introduction, you promise a lot to lure the readers, and that also happens. And sometimes these promises are made to lure the publisher also.
No. Yes, okay, you don't have to go.
So that's one point. The other is about the politics, and you are very right in pointing out we had planned this as a series of interventions. So perhaps in future we can take up some of these rubrics, but organized politics and electoral politics were something that we were consciously avoiding in our approach. So that's another response. Thirdly, and to my mind, and this we discussed a lot among ourselves, we were very clear that we wanted to emphasize the centrality of migration in the making of society itself. making of the social itself, rather than using migration as a kind of to enter into the crisis moment of social. And so in that sense, migration is everywhere. It's something which has to be taken into account by, while analyzing any other social aspects. That was somehow one of the motivating factors for us, motivating agenda for us. At the same time, we were also very cautious that we should not avoid what you called objective structures or objective realities. We should not avoid the inequalities which are primarily pushing migrants to acquire a level of other. So we were clear, but this was also a kind of challenging task, how to, at one hand, talk migration as a foundational aspect in the making of society, and at the same time, how to pinpoint specificities which make a migrant a migrant. And this is where we were playing out with ambiguities, with experiential aspects, with the fluidity, with the idea of transcending the fixed meanings attached to home, destination, binaries of or causalities. So in that sense, this was a kind of humble attempt to flag some of the issues.
Well done.
I'll stop here.
So how does it? Who are the Dr. Professor Anjali Gera Roy? Is she going to speak now?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You have to speak for 10 minutes, I think. Yes.
Yes, that's more than enough. Thank you very much. I appreciate and I'd like to thank IMPRI for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion on a book I thoroughly enjoyed reading. Now, the previous speakers, Professor Prabhu Mohapatra and Professor Pushpendra and Dr. Sadan Jha himself have said so much about the book that I was thinking of what are the new things or what are the things that I wanted to see that they're different. So I think I got the cues from there when Professor Pushpendra was talking about demigrationalization, I think that's a word he used, or not normalizing migration. My mind went back to my research as a post-colonial scholar, where migrancy was seen as the paradigmatic condition of post-colonial of the 20th century. And there was a center staging of the figure of the migrant, and of course, with led by writers like Salman Rushdie and theorists like Homi Bhabha, who the editors have quoted. But yes, as because this theory was very rich and many of us were very impressed by the work that comes from post-colonial theories, but I always had some misgiving with the kind of migrant who was being privileged, migrant as being possessed with a double vision. So we're talking about the elite migrants and the post-colonial intellectuals and post-colonial writers. But there was no room, it seemed to me, for the non-elite migrants. And that I found in the works of Amitav Ghosh when I read his books. In his novels, many of the characters came back to me as I was reading this book. So we're looking at the non-elite migrant, and that history seemed to be much more fascinating to me, how non-elite migrants, ordinary people as I call them, they were on the move throughout the 19th century. We talk about irmitias and we talk about many other categories, which I'll go into. slowly. But I was amazed that, as undergrad students in Delhi University, we read Naipaul's House for Mr. Vishwas. And it was taught to us that this was the era of textual criticism and new criticism, and it was taught without the context, because you had the Girmitia narrative there, but it wasn't brought into the picture at all when the novel was taught to us. So then when we come to the mobility turn in sociology, which is maybe coeval or follows, or the migrancy turn in literary studies. And when we look at people where mobility in the 20th century is the natural condition of people, and also when Malki and others talk about how everyone is on the move. My mind again went back to a book which we all read in our college days, Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, where he talked about, it seemed like such an unlikely idea at that time, that we'll all be living in hotels and we would not have homes. But then when you come to the critique, which Professor Pushpendra rightly brought us in, that how do we make this condition, how do you not normalize that condition? I think it's very difficult to make a conclusive statement on this, because in my own work, I was looking at spaces themselves as mobile, and certain communities which have been taken up in this book as people who have been hypermobile, not just in the modern world, but also for centuries. So let me come to the book proper. So for me, I think the book was very eye-opening in terms of the new narratives of migration it brought. It threw light on. And I would disagree that even though maybe it's not consciously engaged with in the spatial aspect of the migration, what impressed me most was the range, the breadth of the narratives that were brought together in terms of region, the diversity of narratives which were brought together in terms of region, both the sending areas and the receiving areas, destinations as you call them. Also in terms of gender, caste, ethnicity, it was just mind-boggling, and it was so exciting to be able to relate all these, because many of these are well-known, whereas the others aren't. So that was new. And even though it did not specifically mention internal and international migration, the connection between the two, a number of essays do allude to or cross-reference or embed the present phase of migration in the earlier phases of migration, which connects both internal and international migration. And as the editors have rightly pointed out, there's been so much focus on international migration that one doesn't think of, oh, there's been so much internal migration within South Asia. I won't say India, but the Indian subcontinent, because some of the essays go into that. So that part has been neglected. And in this book, we have a number of narratives which talk about a diversity of internal migrations, of different category of migrations. So in the domestic sector, in the industrial sector, in trade, a whole lot of things, which was really mind-boggling. Now, in terms of the kind of migrants that it brought together, some of the essays do use terms like seasonal migrants, circular migrants, others don't. But I was also very impressed by the variety of migrants that were brought into, though even without being named, we got to learn about the number of migrants or the variety of migrants who were involved and who were invoked in these narratives. Now, about the methodologies and the analysis, yes, I have been to a lot of conferences on migration studies, and I've also participated, and the numbers just go above my head. So very often, most of the essays or most of the presentations are on numbers. And yeah, they're interesting, but I just can't lose sight of, okay, so what? So what is exciting about this book is that there is quantitative data, but there is a mixing of quantitative and qualitative. Some essays have more of have used quantitative data in more detail, others haven't. Some are more rich in ethnographic work, others aren't. But this shift was very, very novel and very innovative in migration studies. Now, the second aspect was about the figure of the migrant itself. And I wondered whether it's a modern phenomena. Maybe I beg to differ with Professor Pushpendra about the vernacular terms. And in fact, when I was doing my work, I was looking for vernacular terms for the migrant in different Indian languages, and I do speak quite a few Indian languages. So I did come across the terms you have used, but I was also, there were other terms like, because I was looking at a category of migrants who did not fit into this category of pravasi, or the other word, palayan. I was thinking of sojourners. I was thinking of circular migrants, and I found no words, but there were, I found a term like ghumakkar, where somebody is always on the move, which is like nomad. And in Punjabi, we have the word Panjara or Khana Badosh, people who live with their house on shoulder. So that was, I wish, there was, in the rich variety of narratives which were brought together, what was missing, because we are talking about what was not covered. One of the things I found missing was that there was no, there were no narratives of Punjabi migration, the Sikh migration, because it's a very hypermobile community on which I've done a lot of work, and there's a lot of work on the hypermobility of the soldiers and the Sikhs. And second, most interesting, which I would like to do and someone would like to take up some time, is the mobility of the nomads, the Banjaras and the Khana Badosh people who moved as far as Europe and Central Asia. And finally, the traders, because the Sindhi narrative does touch on that, but doesn't bring in the variety of the networks of the traders, which Scott Levy's book talks about the caravanserai, where we talking about the traders, the Khatri traders, the Shikarpuri traders who have temples as far as Baku in Azerbaijan. And so those were some of the things which I thought could be brought in. And the second was the relationship between the internal and international migration, which I wondered if that could be brought in, because there were so many papers which talk about migration from Bihar. And I was thinking about this, that all the migrant, Ludhiana is mentioned in one of the songs, but there is the connection between the Jats who are migrating to Canada and their fields are being tilled by the migrants from Bihar. So we need to connect this internal migration with the international migration. That was something. Now I come to home, and there, because with migrancy, I don't deal with numbers, but when it comes to home and belonging, I think I have made some contribution, and I think that's why Sadan has kindly invited me to be part of this panel. So this notion of home and belonging, the affective aspects of migration, which this book very richly brings out. All the essays are very rich, but I'll begin with the essays which directly engage with the notion of home. So where is home? And as Professor Mohapatra was talking about the notion of home and Professor Pushpendra also talks about home, and when you normalize migrancy and you also in post-colonial theory, that is a problem, because there's always a sense of rootedness when Anthony Appiah talks about rooted cosmopolitanism. He's talking about that wherever you move, there is the notion of home. So that was this idea of home. Where is home? And the connection the book beautifully makes between the destination, living and leaving, and the home. I think we need to get to the idea of that notion of the originary home, because that crops up in some of the essays. So how do we define home? And what amazed me was the variety of experiences or variety of memories of home that these essays raked up. It was not always the originary home. So when one thinks of, and I wondered if it has to do with the temporality, the further you are from home, as the home becomes more fuzzy and hazy, there is more nostalgia from home. So when one thinks of the Girmetias, there's always this need to locate oneself in a particular home. And the essays in refuge, which are mentioned in the introduction, and also some of the essays where there is the originary home and the pull of the originally home and the nostalgia for the originary home, which is there in the two of the essays, like the Marwadis who always return home. There's always the notion of Desh or the Pind in Punjabis. So there's always a home in the Pind, which is maintained for 150 years. People have been going back. So how strong are these connections to the originary home, and how do these get how do they get weakened over? Do they get weakened? And as the essay on the Bada Bazaar essay showed, that even after so many, more than a century of migration to Calcutta, the link between the originary home hasn't really been lost. But when home is not a happy place, so there's this nostalgia for home, but tinged with memories of loss. So when one talks about the refugees, which one of the essay engages with, Garima's essay, which doesn't really engage with the lost homes, but in the refugee memories, the partition refugee memories, it's a home which is lost forever. But Picho is not something, the rest of the world had to wait for the other side of silence to know what Picho means. But those of us who are descendants of refugees, we always know what is home. It's always the home which is Picho. No, you can't say I'm from Delhi. You can't say I'm from so-and-so city. You say, but Picho, that's the first question. And that's something which has been retained in refugee memories. Now, I don't think I have much time, so I'll quickly come to how what you said about living and leaving, and how you can have these the simultaneity you talk about, and how the home in which you live, sometimes that can become not the originary home, but the lived home also has that sense of nostalgia. So I was thinking of colonial cities, like the nostalgia which a city like Bombay produces, or a colonial city like Lalpur, which has vanished from the face of the earth because it has a new name. But we have a group called Lalpuris, and all the memories converge on a colonial city. It's not an original.
What is it? It's Faisalabad. What is it called?
Faisalabad. Yeah. Faisalabad. So these memories converge on a city which might be a modern city. It's not, you're not harking back to the ancestral village, but you are looking at a city which becomes home. It could be Bombay, it could be Lalpur, it could be Delhi or whatever. So there is this layers of home. In some of the essays, we talk about trans-regional migration and how people adapt and how they insinuate themselves. I would like to use the word insinuate themselves into the local economy and finding a place for themselves, like the Sindhis that Garima talks about, how they convert themselves from Sharanarthis to Purusharthis. Each of the essays I've been reading, and I haven't made notes, but I remember them, each detail. Each of the essays goes into this. And if I have a couple more minutes, I would really talk about the work where I think I can claim some expertise about music, because those are the essays I really loved, the ones on the songs and music, because that's where I work. And, my research on migration more of the research of the ordinary Sikhs and the ordinary people who migrated. It was music which led me to it. And I've always wondered, why did we use this boli, bari barsi khadan gaya se khat ke le aanda? So I always thought it was some kind of, formula which is used, and I could never understand why it was bari barsi and why did he go away for 12 years and what did he earn, what did he bring back? And when I was reading these essays, that 12 year is like a magical term. And then I read the references where this boli came about when the Sikhs started migrating. So the men would, the male migration, and they would migrate, and that's how this boli came about. So you have folk songs like Birha and Videshya, which there are three essays actually, which refer to it, which express the longing for home. And you have references to migrations in these songs, where it's encapsulates the whole history and longing from home, the song. But what was fascinating in the essays on Birha was not just the longing of the person who has migrated, but in tune with what you said about living and leaving, even those who are left behind. What about the situation of that? Of those who are left behind, when you talk about the women who are left behind, and how do they engage with this narrative of migration? So there's a male voice and the female voice. And again, you have folk songs in Punjabi, the famous folk song about Charkha Mera Channan da so it's the women when they were left behind in Punjab, it's the sisters or the wives who would be spinning the charkha and asking for the long life of their brothers and their husbands. So there's a whole genre, it's called Tola or something, or I just can't remember the genre, where it's a male who takes up the female voice. Nit khair manga sonya mein teri, Hansraj Hans. So it's a male voice which expresses the longing of the women. So those essays, I can't go into detail because there's no time, but I really love that. And then the cityscapes, I'll conclude with that. If I have a couple of more minutes, do I?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the work which Garima's essay and the essay on Bada Bazaar about how the migrants have transformed the spaces. So the space itself becomes a migrant space. So we have always thought of certain spaces as migrant spaces, migrant cities like Bombay, but we haven't thought of Surat as one, right? Because in the mediatized narratives, it's Bombay, which is the city of migrants. So here, when we look at Calcutta, I was actually talking to Alka Sarogi, who she quotes, Swati quotes, and when I read that, because, I've lived in Calcutta and I lived in Kharagpur, and there is a narrative of Marwaris. So, but when I can be very conveniently, because I have lived in so many cities, whenever it suits me, I become Bengali, whenever it suits me, I become Bihari, or whenever I become, so when I look at it from the perspective of the Bengalis, there is this very negative narrative which Swati talks about. And when I read Alka's book and I was talking to it, I had no idea for how long Marwaris had been there in Calcutta. So that was really fascinating, and how the enterprise of the Marwaris has contributed to the, building of the city itself, not just after post-colonial, but when we think of the Jagat Seths, as early as that, there's been a contribution. And Alka Sarogi brings it beautifully when she talks about the character, Kishore's character in the book. And it kind of ties up with Garima's essay on the Sindhis in Jaipur, because that's another city we lived in. So I know it resonates with me. And maybe she was not born then, but I've lived in that Adarsh Nagar. So there are these refugee colonies all over India, and the refugee entrepreneurship, the capital, the economic capital and the entrepreneur capital that the Sindhis and the Punjabis brought to these cities, that hasn't been engaged with. So Garima's essay was very fascinating, because I know those markets and I know how those markets, because we had relatives who contributed to that in Delhi, in Lucknow, in Bangalore, the commercial street, we working on Sindhi narratives and how the Sindhis have contributed, Sindhis and Punjabis, the Ahujas, which have been mentioned, I think, in one of the essays. They have contributed to the building of commercial street, which is like Bangalore's, prime commercial areas, or Chennai, Chalarams in Chennai. So these narratives, how they change the cityscapes, and finally, how the communities which have settled in this, that sense of belonging to the city, as you said, in where you're living, there is a strong sense of belonging to both. So Pichu is Shikarpur, Hyderabad, Lailpur, Derewal or somewhere, but there's another home, which is Madras, Calcutta, Bombay. Wherever there is this place of settlement, there is that sense of belonging because there's an assimilation. You speak Tamil or I can speak Bhaiya Hindi because I grew up in Lucknow. So that kind of, that assimilation is there. Home can be here and as well as there. In some, it's a stronger sense of belonging, in some it's less. But it can coexist, as Professor Pushpendra and Dr. Charles rightly pointed out. I wish I had time to go into each of the essays because I really enjoyed reading all of them. But I think I should
Thank you.
Bring it to a close now.
Can we have Dr. Deepra Dandekar? Is she here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
I had a slightly different idea about the time, and so I have a slightly long piece to say, and I've written it because I tend to blabber, I tend to lose my direction. So I'll just read it out as quickly as possible. So I want to first thank Sadan and Pushpendra and the IMPRI for giving me this opportunity to comment on their wonderful book. Sadan and I were classmates, and I'm very happy that he still remembers me. I also extend my congratulations to the contributors for putting together an empirically grounded textbook on the history, literary genres, conceptual and experiential exploration of migration in colonial and post-colonial South Asia. Though I have not completed all the articles in this volume, I declare it to be a well-rounded academic enterprise that raises many thought-provoking and critical questions that are conceptually explored and historicized. My speech or my presentation today is a little bit more conceptual, surrounding the concepts of belonging that Sadan and Pushpendra have explored, and all the contributors have explored. So after due diligence to various methods in which migration has been hitherto epistemically explored, mostly from a policy perspective in South Asia, this volume investigates the social side of homemaking that shapes migrant memory and the poignancy of emotional longing for home and safety. Situated as I am within institutions that have explored migration in South Asia from an external history of emotions perspective, migration stories from South Asia are linked to the global reception of South Asian history in the West, rather than highlighting perspectives and paradigms from within that is internal to South Asia, something that this volume expressly achieves. Writing of South Asian migration from the perspective of global reception changes and reshapes the way it is written, since this history is sought to be placed within a global comparative discussion that does not concern itself with South Asian culture. Sadan and Pushpendra begin their volume by discussing the emotional nature of the migration, of the migrant, a feeling of foundational lack or loss embedded within assumptions that normalize staying close to the vicinity of one's home. As the volume explores, migration experiences are primarily ensconced within a history of labor that includes its forced forms, trafficking, or indenture that results in impoverishment. The loss entailed in migration and uprooting hence becomes further entangled with losses entailed in politically systematic and deliberate processes that impoverish its subjects. The normalization of living in the vicinity of one's home may be seen as linked to an agrarian biomateriality that roots persons to their families and communities and to their soil. This physical soil in quotes. This physical attachment is unmarked in emotional terms and is expressed instead as resource ownership, memory ownership, whose memory is it and which kind of memory? In the same family, these are different. Physical relationships of affect with locality, friendships, corners where one hung out, values, language, different languages spoken by different forms of the same language spoken by different members of the same family, contingent on gender, age, aesthetics, food. So whatever the mode of individual departure from biomateriality, the normalization of staying close by is dictated by the alienation of an elsewhere that is non-material, intellectual, or skill-based. One's job that is learned, trained for, desired, planned, etc. So out-migration can also be desired, and adventure is breaking away from the stifling strictures of biomateriality. Attachment and disattachment can therefore be cyclical, experienced in stages, or be age-specific, or contingent on reproduction, feeling one's roots, especially after one has children. Biomaterial attachments, whether accepted or rejected or contested, are closely configured to social embeddedness, while at the same time being unmarked. Nobody says, I feel attached to my soil, though of course there are these dramatic mitti narratives. And beyond emotional speech, apart from instances when people claim ownership or express anxieties about emotional ownership, about feelings, whose feelings, and who is validating what, or then deliberately remembering a closer belonging compared to what has happened in the present. This brings me to the question of emotional speech itself, conceptually. Can experiences of impoverishment arising from migration, especially if it entails violent severance from biomaterial resources, foster articulate speech? Or does it foster song instead, where subversive speech is rendered allegorical and symbolic within the conventions of creative and literary genres? Or when emotional speech assumes a call for political resistance and solidarity, organizing the self? Emotional narratives about migration are often retrospective and deliberate, or recounted in the third person in a way that no longer potentializes the emotional danger of re-traumatization. And with this speech comes glorification, nostalgia, and what Zygmunt Bauman calls retrotopia, a desire of a future that is actually a return to an idyllic imagined past marked by an absence of migration, when everyone allegedly ate off their own and collective lands. In post-stated speech about migration emotions, the desire and indeed requirement of self-protection holds the inner potential to transform migration narratives into stories of compensation that recount conquest over adversity, pride about success, endurance of hardship, faith in a rewarding divine power, forbearance, strategic patience, hard work, endeavor, and indeed resource building that involves placing community members into the new labor market abroad. This is not just philanthropy and local patriotism or community and family loyalty, though that too. It is also a desire to build a migrant community abroad that transports the soil from back home through the bodies of its members, that builds a special home soil anew abroad. This supra layer of soil building hinges upon community alliances, fostering family and economic codependency and network and sharing culture, language, festivals, food, with an aim to construct new alliances. This also leads migrants to support a variety of cultural governmentality back home that promises to retain and protect a mutually agreed upon, pristine, imagined past that is simultaneously an imagined future. The future of returning to the past acts as a powerful panacea, as Bauman underlines, when talking about the European Union and boundarylessness. This powerful panacea erases the present of migrants while simultaneously retaining the importance of this present in symbolic ways that then discursively produce the journey back home as a victorious return. Foundational loss is therefore not just a pervasive and poignant emotional experience that shadows migration. It is also a powerful political discourse about emotions that serves the purpose of partially silencing the gains that migrants make abroad. Emotions about foundational loss are thus more like an internet cloud ready to be tapped into for emotional resources and discourse building about a hegemonically solidified migrant identity abroad. There is no doubt that migration confers conflict resolution and status to migrants and their families, both to those who move abroad and those who remain behind. They build specially functional but precarious financial networks of resource transfer that evade and subvert different legal and banking strictures on both ends of the transaction. The migrant also gains social status at home. That increases his decision-making power. He imports technological cultures of power, like photography, filming, that enhances and transforms everyday crafts back home into globally marketable products that constitute tangible and intangible forms of migrant heritage building. The migrant problem from a global perspective is, however, a gender issue. The allegedly disturbing image of the migrant conjures up unwanted values of rural and uncivilized hypermasculinity, uncivilized in quotes, hypermasculinity counterbalanced against images of feminine dependency and abjectness. While male migrants are seen as the leaders of unwanted communities abroad, they gain more visibility as the potential breadwinners of these communities in comparison to women, even if women contribute as equally to family income through informal labor. Migration therefore centrally negotiates gender. For example, the way in which the Shiva Sena in Maharashtra systematically treats migrants can be seen as a masculinity race from some perspectives that allows educated and elite Mumbaikars and Marathi Manus to posture as a specially evolved species and paragon of cosmopolitan grace and global citizenry compared to his rural migrant counterpart. But what about women migrants who travel alone? Migration also negotiates the gender for women. Negotiates gender for women. I use an example here of the 1996 documentary made by Nilita Vachani called When Mother Comes Home for Christmas, that tells the story of the domestic help Josephine from Sri Lanka working in Greece. Part of a maidservant exodus from Sri Lanka, Josephine's savings abroad changes her gender status back home as the family's sole breadwinner. Though she becomes a decision maker, the change in her gender role is contested by her children as they angrily accuse her of abandoning them. They endlessly demand money from her, which is seen as a compensation for this abandonment. On the other hand, Josephine's life in Greece feels superficial and far from ideal, as she performs domestic duties of child rearing and housekeeping that she cannot perform for her own children and family in Sri Lanka. In contrast, her Greek employer has more freedom to break gender domestic roles, and since she's not a migrant, she can continue to be a loving mother to her own child back home. Josephine becomes a lesser woman as a migrant in Greece, and she also becomes a lesser breadwinner, a lesser woman and mother to her family back home in Sri Lanka because she is a migrant. Continuing in the same vein of gender, as the editors have pointed out, an exploration of women's history of migration in South Asia has highlighted the history of the partition. However, partition, I would say, in my humble estimation, to Professor Gera, whose works I have read with great interest, is not the only ideal example when it comes to exploring how migration shifts, contests, and negotiates gender. Since women's experiences of partition, especially partition violence, may run into the danger of re-essentializing gender binaries. As many erudite scholars of partition demonstrate, women's partition stories are marked by silence. Violence therefore reshapes experiences of migration just as labor does. And the silence and shame about partition violence again silences intra-family or within the community violence by overemphasizing inter-community violence. This silence speaks volumes as it marks honor itself when embodied by violated women, serving to project this violence into a political discourse that holds other communities accountable. However painful this truncation is, it's still not without benefit, emerging from the potential of rebuilding roots in an anonymous elsewhere that proud migration stories often recount, where individual and community pasts can be imaginatively rewritten and reframed, reshaped, adapted to the moment of recounting itself, the interview, for example. As demonstrated by Ravinder Kaur, painful migration is often accompanied with opportunities that are concealed within individual stories that must be read against the grain. Elisabetta Eob, for example, describes the governmentality of post-partition Pakistan as one riddled with personal, emotional negotiations clustered around small benefits as well. She describes instances of how migrants managed residential settlements within lucrative urban areas, places that were hitherto unaffordable, or managed school transfer certificates into elite institutions for their children. And for many, the partition primarily allowed rural-urban migration rather than the cross-border one, as demonstrated by Ashish Nandi. The Muslim exodus to cities like Delhi from rural hinterlands, for example, consolidated Muslim neighborhoods in Delhi that entailed a remaking and consolidation of the community's resources in a way that was far more intense than the bond between a few Muslim families in Hindu-majority villages. Overemphasizing loss of home highlights the importance of the migrant as a person with ownership rights, while concealing his new gains in terms of space, community, solidarity, and resources, which is also, again, a benefit. The power of migration lies in its language. As the editors of this volume point out, as Professor Gera has also pointed out, it is a language and genre that frames migration emotions. And hence, I would again hark to themes of gender and normalization. For example, Bollywood has forever extolled the erotic virtues of various kinds of Pardesi Chhela Babus that valorize patriarchal and very local marriage. The Pardesi has to come and take you away. And here I would return to gender and ask, what about the migrant woman who travels alone, but is outside the paradigm of either labor or political displacement, where she is at times accompanied or supported by migrant men? Patricia Oberoi wrote in the 1990s at some time about married women as migrants within larger patriarchal structures of normalized virilocal marriage that renames and reframes women's solitary migration by eroticizing it as marriage. The concealment or renaming of women's migration as marriage is centrally embedded in the power of agrarian networks, again, biomateriality, that extol ownership, conquest, inheritance, and which are imbricated with imageries of war. The bridegroom procession resembles the quintessential war procession. The bridegroom on a horse, wearing or holding an open sword, his face covered in a veil of flowers that could be an armored headgear, accompanied with fireworks and drum beats, a celebrating army of his camp residents of Baratis. He proceeds to conquer, accompanied by a small girl beside him on the horse, the goddess herself, who confers victory in war. The transport of the bride to his village is similar, evoking imageries of abduction and bringing home war booty. Gender roles are centrally reshaped within this culturalized and gendered migration experience, where women become brides, wives, junior household members in unknown households and villages, and the mothers of sons who are future inheritors and owners. The editors ask the important epistemic question, what about the interim journey? And is that journey always unidirectional? Can multiple spaces not be inhabited simultaneously, as in Yon Zaun, as one of the contributors of this volume outlines? And can identities, memories, and home building not be defined by intersectionality and hybridity instead? Here again, these are all important, very central questions. And I'm again reminded of Victor Turner's idea of pilgrimage. Border crossing and liminality that builds a community of pilgrims, he calls them communitas, on their way to a shrine. It is with the return of pilgrims in a journey in which they carry prasad and the blessings of the deity from the temple located outside physical boundaries that accords them the transcendental power of having crossed boundaries. When these shrines were very far away, sometimes pilgrims didn't return at all. These were, in many ways, sometimes permanent journeys to the other world. The power of the returning pilgrim evokes images of the returning NRI today, and of Lord Rama returning to Ayodhya on Diwali, accompanied by a reconquered wife. The power of the periodically returning married woman migrant to her natal family evokes equally powerful imagery that is seeped through with the nostalgia of a glorified childhood, playmates, toys, parental homes, and an imagined past that was pristine and idyllic, despite a lot of data that we have about the differential treatment of girl children. William Sachs compares the status of this returning married woman called the Dhyani to the goddess Nanda Devi, whose annual pilgrimage in Garhwal is also considered her return, a visit to her natal home. The goddess's return constitutes an occasion for Dhyanis to express their own wishes for marital security and happiness and the birth of sons. The goddess migrant and wife returning to her village is also part of Bengali Durga Puja conceptually. The power of naming mobility as migration therefore gains importance here, as not all traveling, journey, and spatial mobility is called migration. Linguistically, mobility becomes disaggregated from migration from the moment it is renamed as marriage, job, education, picnic, holiday, pilgrimage, training, or the proverbial multi-entry US visa. All these words evoke different images, emotional possibilities, financial prerequisites, organizations and arrangements, aesthetics, cultural concepts that reshape the journey to may or may not fit the migration paradigm. So what then is migration? Sadan and Pushpendra asked the same question right in the very beginning. Since all movements are migratory, however temporary or permanent, and these movements have been common enough throughout history, they're ubiquitous. In my understanding, very humble, of the concept from a global emotions history perspective, homelessness feelings constitute a powerful political discourse about emotions that function like that proverbial internet cloud. Being able to tap into this cloud is performative. It performs the Heimat, the home, the original home, as in how Tilak talked about the Arctic for Brahmins or whatever, original home, primordiality, and confers powers to migrants, helping them rebuild and simultaneously consolidate multiple belonging at home and abroad at the same time. The feeling and performance of migration emotions abroad is afforded recognition and validation, the proverbial residence permit, from non-migrants who live close to their own home and normalize living close to home, feeling entrenched within their own biomateriality. I will end my ruminations.
Sorry, Dr. Dandekar, do you have a short, could you, because I think we are approaching the end of the thing. So do you have 2 minutes or 3 minutes to wrap up? Or do you have?
Yeah,
okay.
I'll try my best, sir.
Thank you very much.
I will end my ruminations today by recounting some of my own difficulties with global migration studies that hinged around the ontological renaming of partition as migration at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. Many German institutions used the moment of 2015 when about a million Syrian refugees entered Germany, much to the moral panic of the German right, as a moment of academic interest about displacement emotions. I was to work on partition oral narratives, and my project partners hoped to prove that migrants would become integrated as citizens the moment they gained legal papers. So all migration emotions would theoretically automatically cease with the arrival of the passport. The decade of the 2010 had witnessed the public inauguration of many new partition archives and museums that commemorated the partition. And so the stage was set. Renaming constituted my central task. For the success of my project was contingent on transforming the discourse of partition into the story of global migration, a story that would help German academics understand their own emotions about migration and historical relationship with it now that they were confronted by a million Syrian refugees. Instead of concepts and experience from South Asia, my research was to be geared to the global reception of migration that was from South Asia. South Asian migration was to act as a prism for the German context, not to learn about South Asia itself, but to learn about Germany and its own relationships and interests by reflecting it against other historical contexts. And this is where the dissonance set in, since renaming and ontological reframing was not that easy, especially when confronted with primary and secondary sources that highlighted the uniqueness of the partition as situated in a specific historical context of post-colonial independence. Many of my colleagues were unable to understand partition violence that accompanied displacement. Why had people themselves, migrants, suddenly attacked other migrants? Why had Hindus and Muslims suddenly killed each other? Why was the loss of homeland expressed in the violation of women? The dissonance grew unbearable over time as my partition stories elicited embarrassment and alienation lurking just beneath the impassive scientific expression before it grew disengaged. The partition told them nothing about how Germans would confront Syrian refugees. It was as if I was revealing some barbaric Oriental world to them full of blood rituals when I told them about the gangs of men awaiting refugee trains at the border, sharpening their swords on railway tracks. I finally stopped in my tracks after a colleague full of morbid excitement asked me whether these gangs were Kali worshippers. At the end, therefore, I felt that migration was not one experience unless it was named as so, and that naming was a political act associated with a discourse about emotions that strategically benefited and conferred multiple belonging while transcending and transacting between different varieties of social status located at home and abroad. This is exactly where my own renaming and reframing of partition failed, because most partition refugees never returned home. As conclusion, I would say that migration emotions are political emotions, and their recognition and validation by non-migrants who value their own biomateriality confers migrants with a special power that contests their gender, turning men into saviors and women into ferocious goddesses. I will finally end here by saying that I'm indeed still enjoying the wonderful volume, and I thank my hosts and Sadan for inviting me to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an interesting paper. Now, we're very keen to hear Dilip's, Professor Dilip Menon. Dilip, would you?
Yeah, I can.
Hi, Dilip.
Yeah, I shall make no attempt to keep to time since nobody has. So I hope, but I will try and stay within 15 minutes, which is the limits of human tolerance at this point in the seminar. So this was an excellent book. Even though I read it in digital form, I usually hate reading in digital form, but I read it from cover to cover or from first page to last page. And it works as a book. It works as a source book, and it works as a book that points towards new directions for research. And I think very few books actually manage to combine the excellence of a monograph with being a source book in itself, because there are innumerable essays which actually speak about new material and so on. So the 3 points that I want to speak to. The first is, and I think what I want to do is to think alongside the book, and there will be many implicit criticisms as well as appreciations. So I want to think with the idea of the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei's wonderful documentary called Human Flow, which actually speaks about human beings as being in a state of motion, rather than working with the idea of the nation state, which is implicit and is the limiting framework within which this book is written. And that's something we could think about. Because for the last decade, as Deepra pointed out as well, we have had the movements of the Rohingyas, the Syrians, the Sri Lankan Tamils from an earlier period. And increasingly what we are seeing here is that names like the islands of Lesbos, the island of Lampedusa have become part of an international vocabulary, as everybody located within a seeming nation state has begun to think with wider geographies of movement, wider geographies of displacement, and the ongoing war, for example, against Ukraine, where you have the Ukrainian refugees now moving into Europe. And so we have to think with a much larger landscape within which this is located. This is something that Professor Anjali also pointed to. One of the things about COVID hard lockdown was that it reminded us of a regular movement that used to happen over a very long period of an east to west migration of labor coming down from Bihar towards the southwestern coast, and then their forcible return, right, which was happening, but which was cruelly accelerated by the hardness and the thoughtlessness of the lockdown imposed by the government. So while this reminded us of the rhythms of industrial capitalism which sit alongside the times in which we live in, we are also, in one sense, forgetful of the rhythms of agrarian societies, that much of this movement is conditioned by agricultural cycles, by sowing, harvesting. And so there are these multiple temporalities that come together, which match the rhythms of migration. And these have been sedimented, as wonderfully shown in the book itself, in the songs of Viraha. And also, if one thinks about it, the fact that monsoon plays such a huge role in our Hindustani classical music, for example, the peculiarly anticipatory melancholy of rags like Megh Malhar, because monsoons are when the men return, whether it's from the military labor market of the 18th century or that migration, the east-west migration that has been happening over centuries. And so alongside the folk songs, as they're called, I'm going to call them traditional songs, the rhythms of labor come to be embedded in what we now know as higher forms, right? And these distinctions between Margi and Desi and so on make little sense, because the impact of migration is felt across society. And this is an important thing to remember. So I think the use of the folk here, the word folk in the essays, actually hides another history, right? Because if you think about classical music, I mean, very often rags like Bhatiyali and so on are rags which come from a folk realm and then they become classicized over a period of time. The volume's engagement with traditional songs was something that speaks to Prabhu's question about spatiality, because songs travel, right? Songs travel with people. And so you have an entire sonic scape that is implicit in these essays, which stretches from Bihar to the Caribbean, as in Praveen Jha's essay. So in that sense, we are talking not only about physical movement, we're also talking about sensory landscapes, we're talking about emotional landscapes, and we're talking about particular kinds of movements where there are things which are seemingly rooted, which are also wandering. Songs which originate in particular language and dialect groups, then find a much larger geography within which to travel from South Africa to the Caribbean. And it's an interesting thing about language that very often we pun on this word, on these words, roots and roots, R-O-U-T-S, right? And this comes up in many works on migration. And I think there's a hidden laziness in this resort. I mean, it's a great pun, of course. Roots and roots, that roots implies organic rootedness and roots implies human movement. And so, and this is something that Amitav Ghosh's work, The Great Derangement, has reminded us, as well as his more recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, has reminded us that we need to have a social sciences that thinks humans, plants, and animals together, right? And so when we begin to think about humans, plants, and animals together, one obvious empirical thing is that when human beings travel, animals and plants travel alongside with them, which is why you have the native breeds of mangoes from the heartland of the Indo-Gangetic landscape, which are present in South Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, and so on. One of the most wonderful stories of the refugees moving from Ukraine was how a large number of the refugees wanted to carry their animals with them, with their dogs, right? So I think we need to think with this and not have this only human-centered kind of argument. And even when one goes back to that lazy pun of roots for plants and roots for humans, one of the things that climate change has really occasioned is the vast migration of plants, right? Which is not through humans, that plants are moving at the rate of 420 meters per year, right? 115 centimeters per day to live in the same conditions. As climates change, environments change, you have vast bodies of plants which are actually moving through creeping roots, floating seeds. For example, the Forest Service data from 1980 to around 2015 in the eastern US shows that 3/4, 75% of the species have been moving at an average rate of 10 to 15 kilometers, right? So what do we do with this pun, roots and roots, right? We have to think a world which involves humans, plants, animals all together. One of the things in the book that struck me as being fascinating, because I am interested in the idea of developing concepts from the global south. As we know, our social sciences are southern fact, northern theory. Okay? Very often our entire empirical work is beholden to a theory that comes from elsewhere. And I think this is something that we need to, as intellectuals from the global south, need to be thinking about seriously. And what I really liked in the book was the attention to words. And this is something that Professor Anjali also picked up on. Words like, what are the words for migrant? Pravasi, Apravasi, Yayavar, Pardesi. And as Deepra rightly pointed out, our Hindi film songs constantly work with the idea of the Pardesi, right? And any of us can, when asked to hum a song about Pardesi, we can come up with something, Pardesi, Pardesi, Jana Nahi, etc., etc. You could think about many. And you could also think about the word Banjara, which constantly comes up, because the Banjara is both an entity or a group that was a nomadic group, but Banjara has also become a metaphor for an unsettled existence. An unsettled existence which is both voluntary as well as something that is the victim of state power, victim of governmentality, and so on. I've edited a volume called Concepts from the Global South, in which there are 2 essays which actually pick up on the theme of migration. And one of the essays is on a word that's used in the Indonesian archipelago, rantau or merantau, the migrant. The constant out-migration that happens so that you have a class of people who stay at home and another class of people who go in order to return so that the others can stay at home. So the migrant and the stay-at-home are joined at the hip, as it were. One's life is not possible without the other. And similarly, a wonderful essay on Balochistan, which goes back to Khana Badosh, the word that Professor Anjali invoked, that if you think about the province of Balochistan, this essay by Mahwish Ahmed talks about the idea of musafir, which is a very fairly neutral word, right? Traveler. But how this word begins to accrete unto itself many implications, because the musafir is somebody who travels, the musafir is somebody who's forced to travel. The musafir is somebody who travels in order that others can stay at home, right? The musafir is and you could go on, you could keep on adding to the meanings of these words. And I think what could be central to a project such as yours, since Sadan, you're planning multiple volumes, is to think about what is the vocabulary of migration that you can contribute, or we can contribute from South Asia, an entire conceptual vocabulary that remains to be created. We need to have the temerity, we need to have the courage to not be subordinate to the kind of, the routine kind of discussions on migration that we are, that we work with, right? Where our concepts come from elsewhere. So that's one thing. The second thing is to stay with the idea of thinking within the nation state, which this volume does, and which we need to think with, and which leads us to the idea of the migrant as somebody who's out of place. This is an inheritance both of colonialism and the census, as well as post-colonial governmentality, and the idea that it's not natural for people to move. That's what human beings do, right? Humans on the move, or human flow, as Ai Weiwei put it. So why do people migrate? And very often there are multiple cliches, the push and pull factors, lifestyle migration. So when I supervised Surat Yengde's PhD on Indians who migrate to Johannesburg, I asked him to read the literature. Luckily, he did not come from the social sciences. He had studied law. And he found the entire migration literature to be completely useless for the way in which he saw the lives before him. And I said, wonderful, that's what we need. Right? We need somebody who actually can set aside the literature and think with the lives in front of them. And so he worked on these young men who came from Surat. And there again, it's a Janus-based thing. Right? I mean, Sadan is located in Surat, looking inwards into India. But there are these young men from Surat who look outwards across the ocean, look to South Africa, look to places like that. Why do they migrate? They migrate for what Suraj, in his PhD, called smartphone migration, because these are all lower middle class youths. They have no connections with South Africa. They are not part of this larger diaspora and the literature which stresses existing connections and so on. These are people who just decide, look, I want to lead a life in which I have a smartphone, I can dress well, I can have many girlfriends, and so on. And so very masculine kinds of aspirations here. They come to South Africa. And Suraj has these photographs in his PhD of these young men who within 6 months begin to look like rappers, in the film, in the American song and film industry. And that's what they migrate for. There is no thought of saving. There is no thought of sending money back home. All the classic cliches of migration studies were set aside. So that's what we need to think about, where there are these constant connections between the local and the international, as other speakers have pointed out. So having said that, there's some of the essays that I would like to speak to, particularly Dheeraj Knight's excellent paper on the creation of sociability in Dhanbad. And this, I think, is an important essay because what it talks about is how migrants create notions of dignity, respectability in Dhanbad post First World War. And this, for me, is a wonderfully resonant essay because it ties up with a whole lot of literature on the question of what it is to be a human in India. Right? Not everybody is human in India, as Ambedkar has constantly reminded us. So Aniket Zavre's work, for example, on touch, right? One of the first books to look at this question of touch, raises the question of whether in India we can talk about society at all. Right? Because the ways in which we separate ourselves from each other, we have to first construct sociability, right? Leave alone society, which resonates with Ambedkar's idea of there being equality and liberty, but no fraternity. Fraternity cannot be legislated, right? It's something that has to be present and is absent in India. So when we look at Dheeraj's work, what it actually talks about is that it puts the refugee with his experience of, to use another cliche, bare life, who tries to construct a notion of dignity, respectability, and society, right? Where the experience of the migrant then begins to inform people around them. The question of who am I? The question of how should you treat me? The question of where am I located? And a wonderful monograph on this is Joya Chatterjee's book, right? Where she talks about how it's the migrants from East Pakistan, or now Bangladesh, who come to Calcutta and actually argue for rights. Rights of education, rights of water, rights of electricity, rights to stay, right to education, and so on and so forth. So it is the refugee who creates a discourse of citizenship. Right? It's not the citizen, because the citizen acquires it virasat mein, so to speak. Right? Citizenship is something that they just inherit, whereas the refugee has to create it. So I think Dheeraj's essay points to these multiple filiations and the centrality, where we need to put the migrant at the heart of our understanding of how society, how new society can be created in India. Again, I mean, with Pushpendra's wonderful, wonderful essay, which Prabhu spoke about earlier, Migration and the Making of Villages. And this is a completely counterintuitive essay, because we tend to think about migrants as creating cities, we talk about labor, we talk about the precariat and so on. And one of the things that, and I won't dwell on this, Prabhu has already spoken on this, where one of the phrases that came to mind was this from Irfan Habib's Agrarian System of Mughal India, where we were taught this in second year all the time, that peasants voted with their feet. And then you think, they voted with their feet, and where did they go, right? They voted with their feet and they moved to other places and created new villages on the margins, new villages where they could resist states, and so on and so forth. So this idea of creation of villages through migration is a wonderfully resonant idea. And this is something that Sharon Rose speaks about in that migration from Travancore to Malabar, and the colonization of the forests, the creation of settlements, the creation of very gendered settlements, the creation of settlements that are kind of mediated by the church. There's a whole set of issues there which bring in religion, gender, and movement. Finally, the question of affect and subjectivity, which again, Prabhu raised and that the other speakers have raised as well. I think one of the things in the songs, which is really wonderful, and probably there needs to be another volume dedicated to songs, because as we know, I come from a state which produces the largest number of migrants, right? I mean, for us, the United Arab Emirates is like the 13th district of Kerala. I land in Dubai and I immediately start speaking in Malayalam at the airport, and even the Filipinos seem to understand me. So when we think about this question of affect and this question of the separation, the question of separation, that when the migrant leaves, the male migrant leaves, it creates sexual fissures as well as frissons within a household. Right? And these are what a lot of these songs are speaking about, the desire for the brother-in-law, the unconsummated marriage. And in Kerala, there's an entire literature that has come up, which is called the Dubai Kattupata, or letter songs, right? And there's been, and Yasser, our colleague at Delhi University, has written about it. Where women and men, because they are married and then they are separated, they create an entire literature of longing through songs, through videos, through cassettes. If you go onto the internet, you can see this. And actually, this is a source that we need to bring into this. I mean, apart from YouTube videos and so on, one of the things that before the government banned TikTok videos because of our ill-fated enmity with China, one of the things that were produced during that whole palayan to use the word that you use in the flight, right, from west to east, were large numbers of migrants who producing TikTok videos, right? Songs, speeches, descriptions of self. And that is a massive archive of subaltern subjectivity, which remains to be written about. And we tend to speak about social media, in this kind of, as if it's one word, social media. But we need to start writing about it and engaging with it seriously, because that's where life is lived. That's where you see these fissures and these frissons that we need to talk about. 2 points finally, and I'll stop. Again, I was struck by the 2 essays of the Marwaris in Kolkata, the Sindhis in Jaipur, a double consciousness, so to speak, of belonging, right? Where you belong in one place and the other. And it's interesting that Anjali spoke about Alka Saragi, because Alka Saragi came to mind, Kalikatha via bypass, when thinking about the Marwaris in Calcutta, because the Marwaris are discursively displaced in Calcutta. They're tied to a history of illegitimate capital. Right? So when you think about that whole nationalist discourse that was created in India, it comes and sits on the shoulders of the Marwari, right? The Jagat Seths who sold out India to the East India Company. So in that sense, the Marwari belongs to Calcutta, but is discursively displaced at the same time, discursively delegitimized. So alongside this double consciousness of being in Calcutta and coming from elsewhere, pichon, to use the word that Professor Anjali did, there's also the sense of non-belonging that is created. And this is something that Deepra indicated, where there is this assiduous delegitimization of the UP migrant in Maharashtra, by the Marathi Manus and many other sons of the night soil kind of discussions that happen. So this question of when does one stop being a migrant becomes central. And that's something that Sadan, myself, all of us need, think about where we are. This question of where are you from, right? Which leads to multiple hyphenated identities, right? The Bihari in Gujarat, the Malayali in South Africa, the Asian American, and so on and so forth, where this question remains the unresolved question within our political theory. Because we think with nation states, we think with regions, we don't think with the idea of human flow. So we are constantly condemned to these hyphenated identities, which link us to a past which we may want nothing to do with. In fact, it is something that we may be trying to escape. It may be something that subordinates us. So which leads us to this question of the inadequacy of our social and political theory, which is rooted in ideas of the nation state, which is rooted in ideas of the citizen, right? And we've seen the CAA in India, the absolutely cruel consequences of defining who a migrant is as opposed to a citizen, right? Or who a refugee is as opposed to a citizen. And how do we create a social and political theory that is attentive to human life and human experience, rather than working with these archetypes that are very recent? The nation state is a very recent phenomenon, right? And even when one thinks about the Soviet Union, right? I mean, when I talk to my children about the Soviet Union, I may as well be talking about the Mayan civilization, right? It's something that happened so long ago in the past, right? So we have to think about temporality differently. The nation state being a recent construct, why should it weigh so heavily on our minds when we write? When we need to think with the migrant, we need to think with movement, and to restore Purusharth to the Sharanarthi. Right? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. We have, I think, 2 discussants. Dr. Asha Singh, who's a contributor, and Dr. Swati Mantri, who also, both of them are contributors. I think we need to hear them also. I don't know what time, what about time? Are we?
Dr. Arjun said that he is generous with time.
No, it's okay. I'm saying time means, is it that it's limited or something because of?
No, sir.
Okay.
It's a figment of your imagination, time.
Okay. No, Zoom is fixed or something. It has fixed time sometimes.
No, it is.
Okay.
It's not with us.
Fine. So Dr. Is it Dr. Singh first, if I may? Dr. Asha Singh first?
Yeah, I can go.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor Prabhu. I am really happy to be part of this vibrant gathering. A lot of things have been already spoken, so I'll be very, very brief. And first of all, I would like to thank both the editors, and I'm really glad that my essay on Bhojpuri folk songs was revised multiple times because it pushed my boundaries and enriched my paper. एक प्रकार से मेरे पेपर के स्ट्रक्चर में आमूल चूल परिवर्तन आ गया जिसकी वजह से ये पेपर ज्यादा पठनीय बन गया. So I'm really glad that it happened. And I would like to thank Professor Anjali for spending a significant amount of time on the papers on folk songs, and especially when she spoke about the first person feminine or the male female voice in the masculine songs, because that is one of the theme which I have been dealing with in my papers and my thesis as well. And when she spoke about similar motifs in Punjabi folk songs and Bari Barsi, which is Barho Baris in Bhojpuri, I really felt connected and I felt very, encouraged. And I would also like to thank Professor Dilip Menon for your insights on folk songs. I do agree with your critique on the term folk songs, but as young researchers who are struggling to establish themselves, they use more searchable keywords, which are established academic categories. So that could be a reason, but I fairly agree with your critique on the term folk. And also what caught my attention was your example of Katha Patu, because my Malayali spouse, I am a Bhojpuri person, my spouse is a Malayali person, and when he got to know about the songs I'm working on, he actually told me about Katha Patu. Maybe I'm not pronouncing it very well. Then I found a way to compare the Bhojpuri folk songs and orality with this migration-driven literacy and new orality, because Katha Patu is something which someone would like to theorize as new orality, which is actually driven by a sort of literacy. So I have always been thinking about whether Bhojpuri women got such chance of acquiring any migration-driven literacy, because Malayali women got that kind of chance. So and if Bhojpuri women couldn't acquire migration-driven literacy, then what was the reason? This is something which is a matter of inquiry, and perhaps I'll pursue this in my future works. My reflections on this book are actually not coherent because I haven't read all the essays. So I have a set of disjointed questions and thoughts, and some of them are already, have been spoken about in this gathering. But I think saying or highlighting those things in other words would also, make sense. This book conceives migration and human mobility as ordinary and inherent dimension of human life, as opposed to extraordinary or exotic event. Can we argue that conditions of human mobility makes it ordinary or extraordinary? For example, Bhojpuri women reconstruct migration in their folk scripts as both ordinary and extraordinary, depending upon factors that shape the movement. Can we then say that what makes it special or not so special are the circumstances and the consequences, both intended and unintended? The book emphasizes that migration is not an event, but a process. It recognizes the constant tussle between migrants' agency and larger processes, institutions, practices, and forces. For example, and all of you have spoken about this essay, and I also want to speak about it. Professor Pushpendra's fascinating reconstruction of the village using migration as a method. The agency of the working class migrant is rightly tied to his or her objective conditions, such as control over land. Professor Pushpendra argues that struggles for land and dignity are struggles for belonging and home. So I would like to agree with Professor Prabhu here that there can't be a discussion on home, belonging, memory, or in other words, affective dimensions without factoring in material conditions. They are like skin and flesh. Dr. Sadan in his paper emphasizes the distinction between identity and belonging. He argues that one can identify with something, a place or a destination, but that does not translate into belongingness? Can we think of identity and belonging in the context of women migrants? This has been, highlighted by Dr. Deepra Dandekar. Here I have in mind, and in fact, she also spoke about it, marriage migrants, because this is a category I also have touched upon, not empirically, but I have touched upon in my paper. And also new forms of single women migrants as elaborated by Samita Sen in her paper. Dr. Deepra has highlighted this, and I would also like to underline it, that can we say the single migrant woman is increasingly a legitimate social and academic category. Apart from marriage, economic and associational migrants, I also have in mind educational migrants like us. In Dr. Sadan's paper, one can, that paper, specifically that portion caught my attention, the politics of criminalizing migrants and making them the perpetual other, rendered easily homeless and disposable. He underlines how scores of Biharis have been leaving Gujarat in recent times. In October 2018, there were incidents of attack on Hindi-speaking migrants from Indian states of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh in Gujarat after the alleged rape of a 14-month-old in a village near Himmatnagar. The attacks triggered the exodus of migrants. How do we think this criminalization impacts the migrants' self-image? How do they reconcile and return? This book approaches home as a site of longing with social, cultural, and spatial dimensions. It warns us against the romanticization of the migrant's love for his or her home. It exposes the phrase, love for one's home hides more than it reveals. We can argue that the book problematizes static and regimented ideas of home. And a lot of you have, highlighted this. It unravels the possibility of feeling at home in spaces of leaving and living. So hence, can we conceptualize this volume as a critical addition to existing scholarship on family, kinship, and intimacy with its multi-pronged affective treatment of home in the context of migration? That is also a way to think about this book. If time permits, and I don't think we have much time, I would like either one of the editors to comment on how the census and household surveys collect data on migration. This is something I have been interested in. That's why I'm taking this opportunity to ask. And also Samita Sen mentions that the national data system tends to, and I quote, ignore circular, seasonal, and short-term migration and privilege permanent settlement that values family migration and hinders gender analysis of migration patterns. So what do you think should be the research agenda to fill these critical gaps? And lastly, I would like to ask a concluding question. This has been spoken about as Dr. Sadan has integrated his experience of being a migrant in his essay. Pushpendra sir is also a migrant. So I would like to know how his personal experience of being a migrant shaped the priorities and concerns of this volume. So with this, I would like to congratulate everyone yeah.
Yourself also. You can congratulate yourself also. Excellent essay. Excellent essay. Okay, Dr. Swati Mantri.
Yeah.
Hello, Swati. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
So like as the last one to go, a lot of ground has already been covered, a lot of provocations made, inquiries, a lot of suggestions, new, fresh provocations came in. So I think I would start, which Professor Pushpendra already mentioned in the beginning, that I was one of the, I responded to the CFP, to the open call for papers for the volume. And what attracted me in the abstract, in the long abstract for the call was, home was located as this open concept. It was a fluid dynamic concept. And my own PhD research was talking about belonging as this on a similar footing. So it was more about the processes of flow and flux rather than, the single trajectory that my studies based on migration or belonging or mobility talk about. So all the 13 chapters methodologically pinpoint towards this to this multi-vectorial idea of migration, that migration can be thought of in so many terms. It's such a multi-layered gradient concept. So I think, like already mentioned, so I don't know what new am I going to say now at the end of what, 2 hours, 15 minutes, to not view migration as a multi-vectorial phenomena, and to understand that spatial concept is also dynamic, and in which identities are renegotiated and remade all the time. So one point which I thought where I can contribute here is, when we talk about all the gradations of these concepts, is the intergenerational concept, which my chapter talks about in brief, where we try to understand the consequences of dominant structures, also the multivariate understanding of these open concepts. These are conceptually embedding the narratives, but how do, within family, like someone mentioned, within the families have different understanding of the same concept, or where the home is. So for one generation, the home is back in the native place of origin. The other, so the multi-step of migrations are recognized in this effort. And I think the correlation between migration mobility here in a lot of ways is not just about to step out of a certain geographical spot or a place, but in some ways it was also an effort to step up for a lot of groups. So I think in this sense, which the editors have, of course, mentioned in the introduction, and a lot of chapters do mention about it, that the process of cultural transformation, and it's not just the pursuit of economic records, that has kind of been a motivating factor. I'm not talking about the push and pull factor, but has been a motivating factor for a lot of these narratives to come together, to be threaded together in the volume. I think it will be only fair, this is the only thing I could think of after listening to everyone here, to read 3 or 4 lines from the volume, which are very poetic. It's very poetic, and it symbolically kind of communicates the entire volume very vividly. So it's from the introduction section, where it's written, "For a migrant, home is both a place of living, a residence to take rest and indulge in non-production activities, where her or his body is not merely a commodified form of labor, where he becomes human once again, no matter how routine and how fleeting that would be, and as an object of longing." So I think this so vividly brings in all the narratives, whether, like Professor Dilip Menon mentioned, to move beyond the lazy pun of roots and roots, which I have happily used in my essay, and to really think, so it's really provoking to think about whether the spatial aspect of belonging or movement can be understood keeping aside the human figure, the migrant figure, whether we can think of the built environment in those terms to move beyond the lazy pun. Yeah, so I think I'd stop here, and thank you again, everyone, for having me here. Thank you to the editors for accepting the contribution and enriching my journey of contribution to the volume. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. I think your essay itself also is very, very fascinating. We have already talked about it, I think, as others. So what we do now is perhaps to give Pushpendra and Sadan to speak freely, as a
half an hour each.
If you want to, do you want to speak freely? I just one thing maybe you can mention. It doesn't appear so clearly, but it is important to say that the shift that you have noticed in terms of epistemic shift or whatever, one key aspect of migration has been the shift from migration to circulation. Now, this is taken a long time for us to understand, and to also understand specificity of circulation in case of India or Indian subcontinent. Though I was expecting that in Bangladesh or we'll have the same kind of reverse migration, but they didn't have the kind of lockdown or the kind of thoughtless lockdown that we had. But otherwise, the character of this migratory pattern or this the system of circulation, it brings into focus something else, both structural aspect, but also lots of subjective structure, which are quite different from. So would you say, I would ask this question to, would you say this shift from a notion of migration, which is one-off, or, whatever, moving away to, you might have nostalgia and think stuff like that, but still moving away, and that which is structurally continuous and circular, whether it's 3-4 years, 5 years, or 3 monthly, whatever. Is there a difference in terms of your thinking which would come about because of this? Because if circularity becomes a very important part of, or the circulation is the central, would it be a different way of thinking, or would you just collapse all forms of subjectivities into this, into this idea? Is there a way to differentiate in that? And secondly, just because Dilip's point was really interesting and important about, and it is, I'm not saying it's a limitation of the book or something, but the point of nation state is not merely its relation to the outside. Nation states thing is also internal. As we saw during that thing, the thing that going from UP to Maharashtra, to each of these acquired like a state-like character. So in fact, let's say in terms of migration, nation states' main thing is creating these blockages. Let's say blockages to the what Dilip was pointing out about. If there is human flow, if even plants are moving and these blockages are continuously being reproduced. It's not only from outside, not in. So this is, I just wanted you to reflect on that, because even though you haven't specifically dealt with international migration, internal migration, or whatever you can say, this forms of creating, where state creates this internal boundaries. So let's say, I don't even want to call it this forms of blockages that it creates. It creates it. What's the logic of that? The logic of control, logic which is whatever. Governmentality is one specific mode, but I think it's something to think about. It's in a way in which power operates to produce this. So these blockages are necessary for creating even the so-called outwardly projected idea of nation state. So we know that crossing boundaries is the key aspect of nation state in its relation to migration, is of crossing boundaries. But how these boundaries are produced internally and continuously internally, that itself also should be. So these are two questions I just thought maybe, and maybe this other thing which had been picked up also on marriage and migration. Nitin Sinha's essay, but in several others, marriage, migration, this is also in Samita Sen's thing. And in a way, it is, in a way, what you call, they are both homologous, that means they seem to match each other in their kind of, and at the same time, they have some differences. I think that's very important to understand what is it. The birha can be because of a doubly displaced person, a woman who moved from a parent's home, now she's separated from a husband or whatever. So, the way marriage and migration, so-called marriage migration, which is, I also don't believe at all that this is really under. Samita shows that about 5 times more women moving than men in India. India, maximally the maximum movement is of women, but it's all been put under something called marriage migration. They're mostly marriage migration. But actually, if you look at it, if you look at the Uttarakhand or say or in the hills, much more clearly, these are systematic labor migration, movement of people to, you get women to work. And this is so well studied by even hardcore institutional economists who have studied this in Telangana, how these marriage migrations, how it is so clearly linked to a labor requirement. So it is a form of, it is well known as a form of mobilizing labor in some sense, but of course, it comes in within all the things. So this homology as well as its differential. So these are three things which I would have just, if you have to respond, or you can respond to anything. This is just a question to both of you.
Can we also invite questions from the audience? Is it possible? Do we have time for that?
Dilip also wants to ask something. Or
just a minor point. Just
yes,
a minor point.
Yes,
just to carry on with this. One of the essays that really struck me, which I didn't speak about, was this wonderful thing on domestic workers and then the connections with the natal home and the home that they work with, and how the relations of affect become stronger in the latter than the former. And that again was a very poignant essay, and that's all I wanted to put out there. Thank you.
Anandita's essay.
Yes, it was very good.
So can I come in?
Yeah. Unless there are some other questions, someone else.
There is one question in the question box, but I was also saying that can we also invite a few questions from the audience if they have any
I can't see the audience. That's the only thing I have.
There are people in the audience. So there is one already. Sure. We have one question from Sadan Jha, which is there, and so yeah. There are
maybe you
10
could
people
speak
in the
like
audience
while
now.
the questions accumulate, the two of you could speak. And
So Sadan, go ahead.
Okay. I think before I forget, let me do an important task of thanking Arjun and his team for organizing this book discussion and for connecting all of us in otherwise quite alienated world. So thank you, Dr. Arjun, and thank you, IMPRI. Now coming to the discussion and three questions that Prabhu has asked very sharply. A disclaimer, a usual disclaimer that everything can't be covered in one volume. Having said that, the issue of circulation, circularity, and the connected issues of, which Professor Roy also flagged, Professor Menon said, about interlinking the international and the internal migration discourse or realities. First, and this also connects to the issues about national border, nation-state border, its analytical limitations, and also what we felt was a need to engage with the issues, because nation is quite a reality in that sense. So analytical limitations and social reality. There is a kind of challenge how to engage with both. Now coming to these two, perhaps marriage migration, Professor Pushpendra can better engage with. See, we had this challenge. As a student of history, we are aware of the discourse, a very fascinating volume of essays on circulation. And also, as a student of migration studies, we are aware of the circularity dimensions. Now, while opening these aspects or the linguistic dimensions as with Yayabar, Musafir, Ghumantu, Banjara, one of the challenges we had, and this is something that me and Professor Pushpendra dealt at length, was how to remain open to the challenges where you want to tap the potential of a Ghumantu or a Banjara, while at the same time remained rooted in engaging with the migration discourse on internal labor migration. So this was the challenge. We wanted to, at one hand, it was easier for us to resolve that all the migrants are same as a Musafir. All the migrants are same as Yayabar. But or just to reject that no, migrants are something else and Musafir is something else. Yayavar is something else. Banjara is something else. So it was easier for us to remain, either or. But it was very difficult analytically to engage with the analytical potentials opened up by both these zones. So, because this is what, when Professor Pushpendra was reading from the introduction, we did not want to romanticize this discourse, because in a sense, there is a danger when you, move to the other side and talk about Musafir and traveler as migrant, of losing the structural inequalities that actually produces migrants as something other. But at the same time, if you don't engage with the Musafir aspects, the mobility, the circulation aspects, then you are again, falling in the trap of migration discourse, which somehow we were trying to critique. So it was this challenge. I don't know. I mean, we have not resolved this, but we were, aware of this challenge, and we were trying to, remain open to the possibilities of both. Yeah. That was one, and this is why, while I take Professor Menon's point very seriously, that we are only engaging with the human society, and we are looking at human society in isolation from whole range of, players, actors, and their subjectivities, their experiences. But somehow we had to also, this is where the interventionist part comes in. We were directly trying to intervene the existing discourse on internal migration within India. So this was, we were very clear. And this is where we also by default adopts different kind of limitations which come as a baggage, the limitations that nation state or national boundaries imposes. So again, we were trying to expose those aspects from within. And this is where we were trying to highlight the regional variations. And perhaps this is also one of the limitations which we talked about, but we could not resolve. There is almost a kind of eerie silence about critique of state in these essays. So, here in that sense, the idea of the social and cultural processes or experiences are quite, in many sense, devoid of the presence of the state. And that's something which is a huge limitation. I agree. And this is something that Prabhu also pointed out when he was talking about the political aspects. But here, somehow we compensated that by fragmenting the idea of the political. And here we tried to go into the more cellular, more experiential idea of political. And this is why perhaps our engagement with the belonging is engaged with the political, but it also tries to go beyond the question of access. The whole diasporic discourse on belonging, or that we have, and that is very enriching, Homi Bhava, and there the question of access dominates. So access in terms of who is who belongs and who doesn't belong. Here we try to translate some of the insights gathered from that discourse in the lives of internal migrants, and how this question of the politics of belonging is not merely about access, is not merely about the binary between belonging and non-belonging, but it is also about stereotypification of migrants. It's also about how migrant community in case of Jaipur or in case of Kolkata actually negotiates and tries to transcend, tries to aspire to get rid of the refugee status, or to actively intervene in philanthropic activities in case of Swati's paper. So, definitely we worked with a lot of limitations, but somehow we were trying to negotiate with these kind of, the difficulties. And, lastly, only analytical concepts don't throw challenges. Sometimes, and many times, these simple words also throw a lot of challenges of how to deal with them without losing the grip, or without losing the agenda that you are intervening in an academic discourse on migration. So, Yayabar, Pravasi, or Musafir, these actually pose a lot of challenges, but somehow we try to make some baby steps in that direction.
Big baby steps. We'd like to take big baby steps.
Boss baby.
Pushpendra, there's a question also. The question is that what is saying? This is by Shiv Prasad Rambhatla, who says there is another side of migration is vulnerability of the migrant as well as the local populations, and also harm to local resources of the native population, especially of the indigenous communities. Now, that means migration enriches cultures and environment, but also depletes, or in some sense diminishes environment. That's should we look at it that way? If that is right, Mr. Shiva Prasad Rambhatla, if you're there,
Shiva Prasad ji is a former professor of University of Hyderabad. Sociology, and he was head of the Department of Sociology, and he also was a chair, RBI chair in Council for Social Development, Hyderabad.
एक रिक्वेस्ट है प्रोफेसर पुष्पन जी, यदि मैं एक लाइन और 1 मिनट लूंगा.
बोलिए.
I just forgot to respond to Asa's query. Now that's how our subjective experiences as migrants shape this volume. It's a big question. It's quite open question. Professor Pushpendra will have his take. One thing I was very clear and was that it is more than my personal experience. I have recounted that journey in my piece, but it is also somehow we wanted to emphasize the social and cultural aspects rather than the economic centric approach to migration. So that was, and this is where my own subjectivity, how I live, what happens when I come home, all these somehow went into deciding what we wanted to do and our the collaborative exercise. This was a short.
Yeah. So I would also begin with thanking IMPRI and also all the speakers. We got various perspectives, and also in some sense also one starts wondering whether these are the things in the volume. So sometimes you do very things unconsciously, and then you realize suddenly somebody picks it up, and then you realize, oh, it's there, and then you feel very good that somebody has pointed it out. So that's a feeling I was getting when you were speaking about the volume and also individual papers. I would take up just one this question of the terms or words used in migration, and then I will come to these questions. Actually, we had long discussion on this, whether we have with terms in vernacular or not. And knowing very well that we are not, we don't know many languages. So when we are saying vernacular, we are actually confining ourselves to the languages which we know. He knows Mathili, I know Bhojpuri, then we know Hindi. And that's the more or less, and little bit of, say, maybe Gujarati Southern has picked up. I understand Marathi, but that's our limitation. So when we say vernacular in our sense, that's the personal limitation which we had. But within that limitation, we had discussion. And so there are several things. For example, if I say Ghumakri, what do you call Rahul Sankirtyan? A Ghumakkar. And he is called a Ghumakkar, but he is not a migrant. And as a person who goes to different places, collects knowledge, and then he writes about that. And you have Kaka Kalilkar also. So the Ghumakri is very well established. So we had this problem of what to call it. Like we have a community called Khana Badosh. Or in, say, Bihar, you have Bakhos, and in the past also a few other communities were treated as Khanabados community. And in Rajasthan, there are some are called Khanabados. And this has become part of the official language. So it's very difficult to link those with migrants. So in that sense, migrant as a modern conception, is a modern figure. And there is this junction, this junction in the knowledges, in the languages which we know, was very stark. And that's how we said that in our language, they are like, it's more instrumental. For example, people will say, "Oh, kamane gaya hai." So a migrant is seen. So there is the immediate needs which compel people to migrate. So it's just limited to that. But then the migrant who goes for kamane is not confined to that earning. And there's a whole lot of processes which accompany a person. So those are lost somewhere. So this is what we wanted to highlight, given our limitation about languages. Okay. Now I would say this, the circular part. Now, definitely, so for us, it's like, it's a very well established that circular migration is just part of, or a subset of migration. But then this circularity is very interesting because this is less explored. When you say, or it's explored mostly in economic literature with limited set of data. Even in economics, they said that we don't have much data about circularity because the way data is collected, and somebody asked about this question. I think Asha asked about it. So look at the way the data is collected in NSSO. There are 4 rounds, and in each round you go and you ask certain questions, or even in census. But what are those criteria? The criteria is basically you are asking whether you are living at the place where you were born. That's the first. So birthplace and current say place of your residence, whether these are the same or they are different. If they are different, is the one way of understanding migration. And the other, which is whether this is your usual place of residence where you are enumerated, or these are different. Again, the usual place of residence is more quantified, where you have stayed regularly for 6 months or more before being enumerated at this place. So that's how this circularity is understood. And in micro studies, you may add for 3 months, for 6 months, but it's very difficult to quantify, or even the quantification, I'm saying very difficult. But, and we are aware about this, the problem of understanding circularity more in narratives. And somewhere this was in my consensus when I was writing my paper, and there you will find there is discussion about circularity, because most of the migrants whom I studied or I found in the village were all circular migrants. And then look at this, the conceptualization of circularity by the migrants themselves. And I have actually noted it down. For example, there is materiality. So somebody is saying that wahan jaake khayenge kya, kamayenge kya, aur khayenge kya. And it's why they can't take their family there. So this circularity is then linked not just with kamana and khana, it's also linked with their family. They say that they don't earn enough to take their family along. So there, this belongingness is not in just in terms of income, or not in terms of the land or other the home they have left behind. It's also in terms of living with their family. So what I'm saying, circularity in my paper has come in different ways, and I would like to just quote one this paragraph, not paragraph, a small say quote from one of my respondents who is saying that there is no belongingness at the destination town. Sahar apna nahi hai. Permanent migration is a luxury. A few Brahmin families have migrated, but they are doctors, engineers. They may have land in the village, but that is property for them. Their sense of belongingness ends with the death of their parents, whom they leave behind. So even if there is, say, the material at the village, there is property, but then property alone doesn't constitute belongingness.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying, it's quite this sense of belongingness here comes in a very complex manner in their own conceptualization. And I tried to bring that clearly in this, to the extent possible in this paper. Now, and I feel that it is less captured in migration literature. So perhaps we need to do more. And particularly when you start capturing these kind of narratives at destination, rather only capturing at source, I think that will add more dimensions to this understanding of circularity, because it depends where you are actually speaking to people. If you are speaking to people in village, then the things which are going to be emphasized by migrants will be different from if you speak to them at destination. Now, nation state thing, which Sadan has already said, and I don't have much to add except say reiterating that disclaimer that this a limit how much one can do in one volume. So the way volume was planned, but we understand it's we cannot artificially divide as internal and external migration or human beings from other environmental or ecological surroundings where you have animals, plants, and other things, other living beings with you. Now, marriage and migration, I think we have paper, particularly Samita Singh's paper explains it that very well. It also uses some data, few places, but basically mostly narratives. And there it's very clear that we have seen this marriage is not just marriage, it's a dislocation of somebody, but that dislocation is along with everything else. It's not just the conjugality. It's also your labor. It's also adjusting to new environment. Also the identity part. For example, I would tell about my experience. My mother still feels that we belong to our father's place, father's family, and she belongs to her maternal family. So ऐसा कहेगी कि तुम्हारे बाप के जगह पर ऐसा होता है या इनके जगह पर ऐसा होता है, हमारे यहाँ ऐसा होता है.
दिलीप का माँ के जगह पे ज्यादा होता है दिलीप का.
So this is what I'm saying. This marriage migration is, it's so convenient. It's basically, you can say more, it's about quantitative. You have to enumerate people, and for the sake of the convenience of enumeration, you try to club together, because in quantitative data is basically it's a classification, various categories, and then you see that how much is possible, what is feasible in quantitative sense, and we cannot take these quantitative concepts into the subjectivities of migrants. And so in migration studies, we have to conceptualize these terms differently, and perhaps this is not a good term to actually use in these kind of studies. So that's my understanding. Now Suprasadji's question, I think, is what we have seen, that there is a complex relationship between migrants and the locality or the place where they live, because there is constant effort to also belong to that place simultaneously, which is already highlighted by Kalyani Wortha's place. And one way to belong simultaneously is to also acquire some property. It may be in the form of a kholi. It's not just for living there and staying there, but also some sense of creating a stake, property stake, something. And then you start also building your documentation where your permanent address is of your destination. It's not of your village. So there are so many ways in which people try to be part of that locality, and in some sense, at certain stage, people become like naturalized. And how people naturalize, how they become a part of the urban poor, and where they're after some generations, people stop mentioning like they're belonging to their ancestral place. Then what I have also found in my field work, that genealogy is just to find your origin. So for me, and if I can say that I am a migrant, but for genealogy, I would say is from Tekari, Gera. Otherwise, if you ask me from where are you, then I will say I'm from Gopalganj district of Bihar. I will never mention Tekari, and it never comes to in my imagination also. Tekari, I've never been there. I've not seen. I have no affinity with that. But when you start your searching your origins, then I will say finally they came from Tekari, and from where they came to Tekari, I don't know. So that's why I'm saying. So the entire understanding of where do you belong, at source, at destination, and they belong simultaneously. That's what we see. And there is a tendency to actually perpetuate your interest at your destination. And or if not for yourself, sometimes some old people, they actually long to go back, but they want their children to come, and they create for those kind of properties or some stakes at destinations, so that this is like continuous as a process. So this is what I see, and in that process all the conflicts happen for those finite resources, and also the identity, the language, and other things that unites many times, that also creates surprise, also some attraction. So you have Chhat Puja and at destination, it also attracts a lot of people, because it's maybe also the religious affinity, that within the same religion you have different types of traditions, different types of festivals, and people learn from each other. And they also try to assimilate. And I have seen these festivals, how they become very assimilating force, because it's not just the North Indian who gather in Mumbai to celebrate Chhat. It's Maharashtrians also, or from different regions. So in that sense, there is also the struggle, and as well as there's some way, in some ways there is cooperation. Social networks can become a point of conflict, but can become also a point of support. So, but then these social networks, they create, of course, they create conflicts, because then if through these social networks you are perpetuating your identity, and so there is a constant struggle between assimilation and your separate identity, which we see in these processes. And these are, as we said, these are amorphous, these are fluid, and these ambiguous categories. You can't have a definite answer to these. That's how I see some of these questions. Yeah. So I will stop here. Yes.
So I think we can all stop here. It's 9:15. We've been here for nearly. What time is it, Dilip? What time are you in?
It's 5:15 here.
Oh, 5:15. So you are
early.
Yeah.
I'm behind you.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is why I'm so cheerful. I can talk forever. You guys
an hour for us. It's 9:15.
Yeah. It's 9:15. Thank you very much.
May I just have an
anecdote? Sure.
Because one of the things is that I really think that, if we are to address this question of migration, one of the things is that of doing ethnography as well. So to give you a small story, I went to Durban and I went to a restaurant and I looked for a Pakistani restaurant because I could then have my kebabs and whatever it is. And as I walked in and ordered, the Pakistani owner said, "Kaise hain aap?" And then he said, "Aap hamare saath khayenge." So I thought, well, he wanted me to sit at his table, but he was actually on a video call with his wife and he was having dinner with his wife. His wife was sitting, and this is important. We need to think with mediation, we need to think with technology, and we need to think about contingency and about creations of home. So he said, "Acha, aap hamare saath khayenge?" So I said, "Namaste, bhabhi," and I sat down as if I were in their house. Then immediately the lady covered her head and she looked to the back and said, "Dekho, mehman aaye hain." And the members of the family came out and sat at the table and we all had dinner together. And I think this is very, very, very important. See, there are ways in which home is not somewhere out there. Home is created wherever people are, through WhatsApp, through TikTok, and somehow the literature doesn't engage with this. We are like light years behind what is happening right now.
So Dilip, just to ask you this question,
yes,
because it is so amazing. I remember, you remember also how the STD phones, when it first came,
right.
When it first came, the queues of the migrant workers in Delhi, wherever you could have, just to make a phone call. Before this is STD booth wala. But before that, I'm always surprised that, what does, is there that, has it actually created the simultaneity that we were discussing, or has it, what does it do? Does it make it actually the home come together, or it produces an infinite gap? Because I'm wondering.
I don't know, it's a question. There is no answer. We can't provide answers. It's a question.
So like say the guy from, I used to read these letters written by guys from Trinidad too. So they wrote this letter which would reach the village, say about 6 months later, whatever. They don't even know the answer. The letter is asking a question which is sometimes so strange. They were 12,000 miles away or 12,000 kilometers away. They're asking, is this field, इस बार क्या खेती में ये field में क्या हुआ? It sounds weird. I'm again telling, this is another form of simultaneous, as if they are immediate, without TikTok or without this, they're writing this letter. Exactly. That's what I mean to say. Is it that with this immense distance, they try to close it by asking this question?
Yes.
Bhaiya ka wo bhabhi kaise hai, uska pair kaise hai? They must have left 2 years back, and they talk as if it is happening right in front of them as they're writing, Right. So this, as opposed to like your experience, which is again, it's amazing what would have done. Can we map a change? You are saying we must map a change which will happen, or would we, if we do dig deeply, find it is the same?
Well, in different ways, different mediations.
That's.
It's something I would maybe jump in here. This is a very interesting question that you've asked. I think by now I've achieved simultaneity entirely. I mean, it was very difficult in the beginning because the distance seemed, I mean, every aspect of the physical world seemed to shout out to me, distance, 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 difference, I'm surrounded by different language, white people, all sorts of different things, which I knew, but which was still different. And I think it has taken me 10 years to achieve that state of vacuum where I don't completely live here and I don't completely live there. I live in both together. And of course, there are many people who say, oh, but don't you feel lonely? You have not really integrated into Germany. And people in India ask me, "Wahan dil lag jata tumhara? Tum fir kaise?" तो उसका जो एक ट्रिक है वो ये है कि कहीं पे भी बिलोंग नहीं करते हैं, दोनों जगह पे एट द सेम टाइम मन में 2 टाइमलाइन चलता है, मम्मी का और मेरा, जो अब उसका डिनर मेरा लंच, मेरा ब्रेकफास्ट उसका लंच, वो चलते रहता है साइड बाय साइड along with my Zoom talks, along with my work. It's a sort of a weaving of time and space which is defined by actually isolation from both.
Thanks. It's really, really, really fascinating because we are all in some ways migrants. True, we are all migrants. We are, I think. And we
एक साथ खाना खाया अभी?
खाना तुम्हारा कॉफी का टाइम है, हमारा तो ड्रिंक का टाइम है भाई. About plant migration तो कह रहा था दिलीप. The biggest plant migration which happened was of ganja. I thought you would be coming there. Without that, ganja went and conquered, Rastafari. Imagine.
You all talk about what we are interested in, Prabhu.
What are you interested in? Rooted plants? Or?
Gajar.
Plants and roots.
I would, before we end, I would also like to thank all the panelists, Prabhu, you, Dilip, Professor Anjali, Gera Roy, Deepra, Swati, Asa. It was fascinating for us,
Yes.
editors, because as Professor Pushpendra said, we did not, when we started, we did not, or I mean, it's a kind of deja vu feeling. I mean,
Yes.
we still feel that, did we write this?
That's not deja vu.
No, I mean,
Okay.
that disbelief, feeling of disbelief,
Right.
So thank
Sadan,
you very much.
You should carry it forward in other volumes also, when energy and time of you have a certain amount of, I mean, as Dilip has also suggested, there are many rewarding issues that you can take also forward, or that would be very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for Dr. Arjun. Thank you so much.
Sir, would you like to make some concluding remarks? Then we can follow up with vote of thanks as chair.
Who's making all concluding remarks have been made? And more.
Would you like to make?
No, please, we should end.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, it should end.
Right.
As we come to the end of this extremely enlightening discussion, I, Diya Goswami, researcher at IMPRI, would like to formally propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the IMPRI Center for Work and Welfare. We are grateful to Professor Prabhu Mohapatra, Dr. Sadan Jha, and Professor Pushpendra for taking out the time for the book discussion. Thank you for being with us here today. We thank all our panelists and discussants, Professor Anjali Gera Roy, Dr. Deepra Dandekar, Professor Dilip Menon, Dr. Asha Singh, and Dr. Swati Mantri for adding their diverse perspectives and valuable insights to the deliberation. Lastly, we thank all our participants on Zoom or on Facebook Live for participating and raising pertinent questions that we are grateful if you're watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our podcast. I hope that you continue to tune in on our future events and talks. Thank you once again, and I wish you all a very good night.
Okay. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.